everybody. I'm so excited for our Lunch and Learn today. We have an awesome guest. Her name is Kelly Charles Collins. We're going to talk about how to mentor when you feel like you don't have all the answers. And this is something that I would imagine is very popular in horizontal mentoring relationships, especially if you're in a mentoring relationship with somebody in a different department than you, or at a different area of expertise than you, or just stage in their career, because you may not know all the answers for them. You may not have the solutions that maybe they're seeking. But really, when it comes to a mentoring relationships, we're here to talk about why it's not about the solutions, but it's about getting to know them and understand them, which is why our work orientation assessment is so critical to pairing you together for mentoring, because we want to align that value system. So I've got an awesome guest. Her name is Kelly Charles Collins. Kelly empowers smart organizations to stay on the right side of the next hashtag movement. Kelly has the unique ability of making complicated, difficult, and sensitive topics approachable. She is the founder of HR Legally Speaking and has been a lawyer for 20 plus years. Kelly, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So Kelly, we're here to talk about how can we be a great mentor to somebody in a mentoring relationship, even if we don't have the answer. So I guess maybe to get started, could you just share with us a little bit about your background? And then I'd love to then kind of dovetail into this topic.
Sure. So as you say, my goal right now in my work as a speaker, trainer, and consultant is to keep organizations on the right side of the next hashtag movement. And that's based on my 20 plus years of experience as an employment lawyer, representing small to Fortune 100 companies on matters that involve employee-employer relationships. And so what I've done is to take those skills and leverage them to really speak to organizations about unconscious bias, bystander intervention, workplace investigations, and the importance of really paying attention to not just the profit center of your organization, but the people. Well, the people are part of your profit, but not just focusing on profit, but people also.
And I would care to argue that your people and your profit go hand in hand. If your people are dissatisfied, they're not going to be an advocate for your company. If they're not an advocate for your company, recruitment costs are going to be much higher, because if they're not happy with their work, they're not going to refer any of their friends or family to come work there. They're not going to think of it top of mind if a new job opening is there. But if they're loving their jobs, they're going to say, yeah, Jane Doe friend, John Doe friend, you should be working for my company because it's an awesome company. I'm loving working here.
Yeah.
I would imagine,
not even just Garrett, not even just for the recruiting aspect of it, but retention, right? So a lot of companies, people say, oh, it's profit over people. And then we got to the point where it was like, no, it's people over profit. But let's be real. Businesses are in a business to make profit. So it needs to be profit and people. They're not mutually exclusive. And if you focus on those two things and make sure that they work together and for the common benefit, then, you don't have any problems. But it's when you start to really focus on one as opposed to the other, to the exclusion of the other, is when you run into problems.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think we become blindsided on one side. You've got a company where everyone's loving it, everyone's super happy, but you're not necessarily focused on the profit. Eventually, you might not even be in business, so then you keep paying your people to keep doing the work that you're doing.
That's right.
On the flip side, if you're solely focused on profit, everybody's going to keep leaving you. You're going to be spending so much money trying to refill roles that you're not even going to be making the profit that you were so focused on building in the first place. And so It's a fine balance, and I think you're really spot on with that. So let's talk about mentoring relationships. So in a mentoring relationship, oftentimes we find ourselves in situations where we've not fully experienced. We can't fully relate. We can't fully understand what someone else is going through. We might have gone through something similar, but we might not have fully experienced what someone else is experiencing. How can we go about supporting somebody else, and not only supporting somebody else, but bringing value to them so that we can help them identify next steps forward?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing in a mentoring relationship is to understand that it's a give and take, right? So I think sometimes we get into these relationships, and if you're the mentor, you have this overwhelming sense that you're supposed to just give, and give, right? That you're the superior person in the relationship. Where in a mentor-mentee relationship, it really is about giving and taking. There are things that you know, there are things that your mentee knows. And, don't go in expecting to know everything. Listen. So when you're meeting with your mentee, listen. That's part of trying to figure out, how's the relationship going? What's happening? Because you may think, oh, today we are going to focus on some particular issue. But if you just listen to the conversation, you'll figure out, you know what? Maybe it's not a business thing that we need to be talking about. Maybe it's a life thing that needs to be happening right now. So really, I think the key thing in a mentor-mentee relationship is to listen. And that will guide your way through whatever questions and answers and goals that you need to set.
I love that. What's really interesting about that is, well, one, we call it horizontal mentorship. So it's not about mentor to mentee, but two people mentoring each other. And what's interesting, I was just talking with somebody earlier today, and they were telling me that in their historical mentor relationships, they were traditionally, let's say, the quote unquote mentee. And what would end up happening was it was kind of like a vague training session where someone would explain, this is how it's done here, and this is how I've done it, and this is the way you should be doing it, which completely stifles innovation because it doesn't open up the opportunity for someone to take their unique experiences from their past working history to say, hey, I've done it like this at other places and it was really effective. I might be able to do it like this here and save myself 30 minutes, an hour of just shaving off time because it's just more effective that way.
Right.
And so often when we are thinking of ourselves as the quote unquote mentor, even in horizontal mentor relationships, I would imagine that this happens too. We get kind of lost in the trap that if we're the more experienced person, that we kind of think that we are the mentor. And sometimes we forget that this is a symbiotic relationship. And so sometimes I would imagine that we could get into, should, and this is what I would do if I were in your shoes mode, when in reality, it's not about that. It's about empathizing and asking questions to really fully understand what somebody is doing. And I love that advice you gave, Kelly. That made a lot of sense. So,
I think it's important because it's even like with kids. I have a son, he's 29, but sometimes I say, oh, you should do this or you should do that. And I have to catch myself and say, maybe think about doing this or maybe think about doing that, because yes, we do so often when we have more life experience or more experience in an area, think that we should tell people what they should be doing as opposed to saying, hey, I did it this way. Maybe this is something that you should consider.
Exactly. And that's or even like, have you considered doing it like this?
Right. Right. Ask a question instead of like giving them the direction. That was a good, yes. That was a good way to flip it, because again, it's still that thing about doing it my way. But if you say, listen, have you considered doing it this way, or ask them the question so that they can make the decision, I think that's great.
And the funny thing is I think the reason why we have as a society gone into the whole should mentality is, I think in our minds, we logically think, oh, people are much more likely to heed our advice if we come from a perspective of confidence and knowledge as opposed to questions. And the funniest thing about human nature and behavioral psychology is that the opposite is true. That if you ask questions and you get people thinking about it differently, if you it protects their ego. By asking the question, you allow them to think that idea is their idea, versus it just being your idea that you gave to them. Because
it's an empowering tool for them, because now they're making a decision.
That's exactly it. Yeah. Whereas if you say, hey, you should do this, it doesn't become their decision anymore. They have lost their ownership over their control. And nobody wants that. Even for a less experienced person, they don't want to lose ownership of control. They want to feel like they climbed the mountaintop themselves. Whereas if you're like, hey, I've got this gondola, it'll take you right up. They're not going to feel like they actually got to the top of the mountain on their own. People like to feel like they accomplished it. It's like the Ikea effect. People want to take ownership of things that they created themselves. So, Kelly, with that said, what are some questions? Are there go-to questions that you like to ask people? Like if you're in a scenario where someone comes to you and they say, this is a problem I'm having, or this is a struggle I'm having, this is a challenge I've got. How do you go about asking great questions to fully understand it and get a deeper understanding of what's going on?
So it's kind of hard to answer that just as a general concept, because I think when you are trying to figure out what's happening with someone, you have to be open and you have to let that, whatever they're saying to you, lead what your questions are. So, for example, if someone said, I'm struggling with A, B, and C, or let's do A, let's deal with one thing at a time. So they're struggling with A. Then I would ask them to explain what A is so that I have an understanding, because they may say, I'm struggling with defining my goals, for example. And I may say, oh, well, that's easy. You can go do, if you want to define your goals, you just need to do these steps. Well, what does it mean by they have a struggle with defining their goals? What are they really talking about? The thing is that words matter. And so you have to dig, right? You have to dig deep before you start to give them the information, or before you start to ask just these, generally broad questions. And so kind of put it back on them. Again, this is the whole part about empowering people to find their own answers, right? So if someone says to me in that example that I'm having a problem defining goals, okay, what do you mean by that? What are the goals that you're trying? Are we talking about personal goals? Or are we talking about professional goals? And when you say defining them, what do you mean by defining them? Is that you just don't even know what they are, or you know what they are, but you don't know how to specifically categorize them? So it's about breaking down what they're telling you, so that they can explain to you, so that when you start to move forward in the conversation, you are both on the same, you're both talking about the same thing. Because so many times we get into conversations and we're not talking about the same thing, right? Because there's no base level of understanding of what the terms are, or what the thoughts are. So there's nothing I could say to you. I would ask this, this, and this. I would ask questions specifically related to what they're telling me, so that I could first understand what they're talking about, so that I can then help guide them, but guide them in a way that they're making their own determination.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's really fascinating. Do you ever subscribe, because I feel like even still following that methodology, what I'd be curious to know is, do you ever subscribe to this notion, this thought process that, okay, the I would imagine kind of thought process? Because I think even in that example, you've given out a couple of ways of they're struggling to clarify their goals. Is it this or this? But could it be something else? And I think what the big point you're making is, we make assumptions about, these things, and then we potentially ask questions or give advice based on that. But perhaps, have you ever considered, or do you ever subscribe to that? I would imagine that, when it comes to clarifying your goals, that, maybe you're going through this. Is this correct? Am I onto something, or am I totally off base? Do you subscribe to that sort of line of questioning?
So I generally don't ask questions in that way, but, but yeah, I think that that's another way to do it. As a lawyer, I've been a trial lawyer, so I've learned how to ask leading questions when I need to take you somewhere, or ask open-ended questions when I need you to give me a narrative. And when I do that, it's because I want you to give me the story, so that I can then go back into the different pieces and help to take you where I need to go to be able to help you, or where you need to go to be able to determine whatever you need to determine. So I'm not a structured person in that way. I've just never been a structured person in that way. And I just really listen. I started practicing law as a public defender. And one of the things that I learned was very quickly is to think on my feet and to just go with what was in front of me. And so I just really listen and just take cues from the what's being said to me, take cues from body language, if I'm with them in person, and then just really try to ask clarifying questions that will help both of us to come to some type of conclusion, or some type of goal, so that we can move forward. So I don't really think about it in terms of, do I ask these types of questions or not? At some point I might, but it's not a structured process in my brain.
Yeah, no, I like that. And I think that's probably more natural for most people, is just not necessarily have this structure, but really that focused, intentional, I guess, listening about what's going on. I think sometimes what happens, I know this happens with me, is when somebody's talking, I kind of hear like the first few words that they say, and then I'm already thinking about a response of like what I'm going to say next, but they keep going. And I know that when I'm thinking, like, it's impossible to multitask. Like, I can't do two things at once. And so if I'm thinking about what my response is, I'm not actually listening to anything that you're saying. Like, once I've heard the first, like, maybe couple words that you said, and it got me on thinking on something else, like I've immediately gone off of whatever you were saying.
Yeah.
How can I avoid that? How can I avoid the trying to process what I think you want to hear based on the first three things you said versus like kind of like ignoring that, or somehow like storing that away to the side and continuing on listening?
So first, our goal has to be to listen to understand, not to respond, right? So I think if you start to practice that, like, listen, I'm here to understand what you're saying, not just to provide a response. Because so often people are saying things to us and they don't want you to respond. They just want you to listen, right? So when we get into these relationships, though, we think people always want a response. And so I know how that is, right? When I sit in court for all these hours, or you sit around and you're just like, okay, I already know where you're going and I want to just get there. And so the thing to do is to really try to actively listen. And that may mean that in between you may say, let me make sure that I understood what you said, right? So force yourself to have to kind of repeat what they're saying. So in order to do that, you have to focus on what they're saying. You can't be over here. My brain's a rabbit hole, so I understand, right? So you have to be able to focus. So if I have to repeat to you what you told me, I have to listen to you. So now I can't be thinking about, oh, what would my response be, or what is my response going to be? I have to be intently focused on what you're telling me. So that's something that I would do.
Do you subscribe to taking notes while listening to somebody else, especially if somebody's giving a relatively long kind of foray into something? Do you subscribe to taking notes?
Yes, I'm an avid note taker. Now, after I take the notes, I can't read them because my writing is horrible. But it does help me so that when I have to go back, especially if someone's telling me a long narrative, then it helps me to then go back into my notes and say, okay, you said this. Can you clarify for me? Or I want to make sure that I understand this point that you were trying to make. And so it also shows them that you're interested. It also shows people. And I often tell people, listen, even when I'm taking notes, I generally don't look at you. If you're talking to me, I will not be looking at you if I'm taking notes. And I tell people, I can hear you because I'm an auditory learner. And so I will hear you. It's not that I'm not paying attention, but I want to take down these notes so that I make sure that if we're having this long conversation, I don't forget to ask you something that's important, or to address something that was really important. Because it may be that one little thing that is like the key to opening up like everything in the conversation. And if I haven't really focused on that or taken a note about it, then I might just overlook that. So I'm, just from practicing, I can take down everything that you're saying and I can basically take it down verbatim. And so I do take notes. I don't, afterwards, I look at them just for refreshing, but not necessarily to keep them for anything.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. I think what there's data that indicates when you write something down, your likelihood of retaining that increases substantially. So I'm a huge note taker, big fan of what you just said there, because I think that makes a ton of sense. Let's talk about something relevant, tangential but relevant to all of this, is this notion of, well, what if I don't feel qualified? What if I don't feel qualified to ask the questions? Almost kind of like I feel like I'm an imposter right now trying to help you with this problem that I really am not like I'm not qualified to help you with because I've never really done it before. How can I overcome this sense that I might not have the experience to give the quality kind of information you're looking for?
So the first thing that we have to know in life, and that I ascribe to every single day, is that I belong everywhere I am. And so in those relationships, there is a reason that two people have been matched. Now, we don't always make the best matches, and people maybe don't always, they're not always supposed to be matched. But just know that we don't know all the answers. We're not experts in everything, but we are experts in what we're expert in, and we have skills and we have talents. And so there's so many times that, there are times that people ask me questions. Even when I was practicing, they would ask me questions about the law, or, how do I do this? I may know generally, but if I don't know, I say, hey, you know what? I don't really know the specific answer to that, but I will go find out. And if I can't find the answer for you, I will get someone who does know the answer to help you. So it's not being brilliant, is knowing what you're not brilliant at, right? That's part of being an expert, or just being a competent person, is to know the things that you are not competent at, but knowing that you know enough to go and find someone to help. So I would never get stuck in this situation that, oh my gosh, I'm never going to know all the answers to their questions. I don't feel like I am the person who should do this. You are the person. You are put in that space, and you are put in that space for a reason. And it may be because you're a good listener. It may be because, you have some life experience that will help them. You may not know this very specific answer, but there are other things that may bring you all together that person will trust, that when you go and say, listen, I'm going to find someone who can help you to do that, that also builds the trust. So don't get hung up on, I don't know the answer to anything, to everything. None of us do. I mean, we just don't. So just know enough to know what you don't know, and be okay with having to go and get someone to help you to get those answers.
Yeah, no, I like that. And I think the other big thing in all of this is, at least this is in my experience, more often than not, people aren't looking for the answers to their questions. Most people know the answers to their questions, but maybe sometimes they're just afraid to acknowledge it. I know one of the meeting agendas we have for our mentor program is about obstacles, both real and perceived. And a lot of times we, through our own fears, put our own obstacles for why we can't do something. Mm-hmm. And we know mentally, we can cognitively go through the process of how we can overcome this fear, but sometimes it takes questioning and maybe guidance and support from somebody else to help us feel the confidence to go ahead and do that.
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess, so what are your thoughts on just people knowing their answers to their own questions? It's just sometimes having someone else there to ask the question to kind of pull it out of them.
Yeah, and for affirmation, right? And confirmation that you're on the right track. It's something I do with my sister all the time, and she'll say, the answer. But I want to make sure that I'm on the right track. I want to make sure that that whatever I'm putting out into the world, that the way that I think that it's coming across, my intention is the intention. It's the way it's being received, right? So a lot of times we speak about things, or we do things with a particular intention, and we say to people, well, I didn't intend for it to happen that way. And it's not about the intent, it's how people receive it. So I will do that. And I think that that's a great thing for people to do, to test their goals, test their questions, test their thoughts, to see if that's how they're being received. So I think that's a great thing.
And I think let's talk about the power of affirmation there for a moment, because I think that is so powerful. I've got a story to share about this. It's my business partner, his name's Dave Criswell, and Dave has been in software and sales since like the 1990s. He's been doing it for a very long time. And what I am so grateful for Dave is that he's really good. So Dave and I actually met through playing tennis. Now, Dave is not necessarily the best tennis player in the world, mean, he's an older guy. He's in his mid-50s. He doesn't necessarily move very quickly. His strokes aren't like overly powerful. His serve isn't going to blow anybody away. But he rarely loses. He rarely loses. When he plays doubles, he rarely loses. And the reason why is because he builds people up. See, he's just experienced enough and just knowledgeable enough that when he gives you a compliment, you know it's legitimate. You know it comes from a meaningful place, and you're like, wow, this guy really wants to build me up. He really cares about me being at my best. And when I play with Dave, whether that be through business, ambition, and motion, or on the tennis court, we rarely lose. We always win, and we play against people that are way better than us. Like guys who are just like, or, played college tennis at like some school or whatever. And we're like, just, people who've been playing around for a while. We'll beat them because Dave is such a great builder-upper of people. And so the point to this whole story is that these words of affirmation in a mentoring relationship can be so powerful, especially if you take the time to listen to what they have to say. If you can actively listen to and not only regurgitate it, but say, hey, this is going somewhere. I really believe in what you're doing. I think this is a great solution. I think you're really onto something here. That could be the confidence boost you need to go out and do it. And for you to do that for somebody else takes you no time. It just takes an intentional focus. And what you give to them is incredible. I can't say how much gratitude I've got for Dave, even though he doesn't even really, like from an hours and time perspective, put that much into the company, but he puts so much into me that when we do have our conversations, it just boosts me up to be invigorated for the week and to know exactly what I need to do. And so that's just a story about the power of affirmation.
I agree. I mean, words have power, and sometimes it's just that one spark that you need to know that you're going in the right direction. Or, just maybe that one day where you're just like, not today, don't want to deal with it. And that person just says, hey, you got this. And that's all you need, right? To keep moving. So I think it's very powerful.
So the last question I wanted to ask is about bias, because we talked about bias a little bit at the very beginning. But I feel like from an unconscious bias perspective, if I meet somebody who's maybe older than me or younger than me or different than me in any particular way, I might have a bias about their ability to ask good questions or their ability to listen to me. I might come in consciously or unconsciously thinking to myself, you know what, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get the kind of insight. I might be setting myself up for failure even going into the mentoring relationship just because of my perception of who I think this person is. How can I overcome that bias?
Well, first you have to, for biases, for you to disrupt them, you have to become aware of them. So if you are conscious enough to know going in that you're making this decision about this person, then that's the first thing, right? To know that is there. And then when it's coming up, to check yourself. So if they're giving you information or asking a question and you find yourself thinking back to that, whatever stereotype you had about them, you have to ask yourself, well, why am I doing that? Why am I thinking that? So it's about checking yourself and then you have to be willing to change, right? And make a different decision about that person. And then you have to change. So biases, we all have them. We get them from things that we hear, read, see, and experience, but they can be disrupted. They're things that we learn, so they can be unlearned. And the thing is to just know that you have it and to not fight against the fact that you have it. A lot of people fight the fact because they think, biases are related to being discriminatory or right now to being racist or whatever. And so they fight the urge to kind of disrupt the bias. But once you realize that you're doing this or you have this information based on things that are not factual or it may just be your own lack of self-confidence or self-esteem that causes you to now question this other person. If you start to just do self-reflection and start to question yourself and interrupt your thoughts, then you can disrupt that bias.
I've got a selfish question because I feel like I deal with this sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes when I pair a mentor pairing together and they're looking at themselves on paper and they think to themselves, I don't know what we're going to get out of this. Like that first question Like if that's the question that comes to your mind, that's already a bias that's putting pessimism on the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Before you get started, you're thinking to yourself, well, I don't know what I could possibly get from this other person. And it's so detrimental because now we're already working on an uphill battle. Now I'm not even working from an open-minded, like I could learn anything in this relationship. I'm really excited to, I don't know how this person could give me anything, or I don't know how I could possibly give anything to this person. Mm-hmm. How can you go about, if you hear someone and they have bias and you can hear it in the questions that they ask or the way that they phrase something, how can you go about calling out bias without, like how can you go about effectively calling out bias, like not that tarnishes their ego or their reputation or their way of thinking, but in a way where they can actually, they say, you know what, I realized I wasn't going in with the most optimistic attitude and I can go about changing that. How can we go about calling out that bias?
So let's use an example. If someone said to you, I can't imagine that I could learn anything from this person. So my coach always has taught me, ask the next best question. So I would just ask them, but what if you did? What if you did learn something from them? How would that change your life? Right? So then it starts to get them to think about something different. The thing about when people start saying those types of negative thoughts, you have to question the thought to make them have to defend against the thought. Because then it's like, well, yeah, you know, what are you going to say? Well, no, I'm just never going to learn anything. I don't care. But what if you did learn something? How would that affect you? Like, how would that impact you? And then, you know, what are they going to say? No, I don't care. It will never impact me. Then you know that they're just not into whatever it is, right? They are intentionally just trying to blow off whatever it is. So, but generally, if you ask somebody that question, right? Well, what if you did? What if you could learn something from that person? What would that be? Or how would that make you feel? Or how would that impact your life? So now they have to start thinking about it, right? And so now they will go into a different mindset. Well, yeah, maybe I could learn that. Maybe if I did learn that from that person, it would impact my life. So just ask the next best question. Just think about what they're saying and think about what the next best question is and put it back on them to follow up instead of you trying to convince them. Let them convince themselves.
Love that. That's great advice, Kelly. Well, Kelly, this has been an awesome topic. I really think we went into a lot of really good points here on how to mentor somebody in a mentoring relationship when we don't have all the answers. This has been a fantastic Lunch and Learn. Thank you so much for being here. The last question I have for you is, how can our audience learn more about you and connect with you?
Well, they can follow me on social media. The best place is on LinkedIn, which is Kelly Charles Collins, or on Twitter, I'm HR Law Attorney, and also on my website at kellycharlescollins.com. It's all one word, kellycharlescollins.com.
Awesome. Well, Kelly, this was incredible. Thank you so much for being here. Everybody, thank you all for being here. Have a wonderful rest of your day. See you, everybody.